Hi, my name is Matt, and I am a do-it-yourselfer in my home garage here, but it doesn't mean that guys like me can't possibly break new ground in the diagnostic science. So that is actually what I am going to try to do today in this video. As many of you are well aware, one of the possible causes for a lean condition would be an exhaust leak. Honestly, I've told many people about that as a possibility on the channel, but I've actually honestly never seen it. And the other thing is, in investigating this a little further, I have yet to find one video or article or anything out there that shows that you can actually diagnose an exhaust leak. I've seen maybe some things where you can detect it with a lean condition, but there is a difference between detecting an exhaust leak and being able to diagnose that that lean condition is from an exhaust leak using fuel trims. So that is actually what we are going to do today. I will set up a scientifically controlled experiment to develop, hopefully, a new methodology. And how cool would that be if it becomes adapted as a technique when it came out of some asshat's home garage? So let's go ahead and talk about what we're going to do, and most importantly, how we are going to do it, so that the only possible variable would be that we are detecting an exhaust leak and that we can actually identify it successfully as an exhaust leak and nothing else. So as with any scientific procedure, we're going to start off with a hypothesis first, which is going to be a bit of a bummer because I actually don't think this is going to work, and I would have better off spent my Saturday fishing rather than trying to develop a new diagnostic procedure. But what basically I'm thinking is, so we have our engine here, of course. This would be our exhaust, which is going to have a front O2 sensor. We are actually going to use a air fuel sensor in this case. I will explain why. Which of course leads to a cat, and then of course the O2 sensor post-cat to determine the activity of the cat. So we're not worried about anything here. We are worried here. The reason I'm going to be using an air fuel sensor in this is a couple fold. First of all, and most importantly, it is the only car I have available where I know that I have a good negative control. It is essential that the car that we test this on has no exhaust leaks to set a baseline, so we can have no exhaust leaks, no issues with oxygen sensing. We have to have no codes, things like that, anything that could interfere with an accurate diagnosis of the induced exhaust leak, which I will cause. The other thing with the air fuel sensors, as most of you know, this is becoming the new standard for the fuel monitoring and trimming. So if this procedure works, then it ensures that this is a procedure that can work in the future, as opposed to being something that would only be good on oxygen sensor vehicles. If it works on an air fuel sensor, it absolutely, of course, necessitates it would work on an O2 sensor. But just because something works on an O2 sensor, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be detectable on the air fuel sensor, because it is much harder to detect variance on an air fuel. However, it should make no difference whatsoever as far as looking at fuel trim. But we do want to be able to see, of course, the oxygen sensing direct response. So what we are going to do is induce, let's go ahead and get rid of this. What I'm going to do is induce an exhaust leak. Of course, the theory is that as oxygen from the air would get into a exhaust leak ahead of the O2 sensor, one fault with this is that it would only detect a leak ahead of the O2 sensor, which is fine. The purpose of this procedure is to diagnose the cause of a lean condition. It is not to diagnose an exhaust leak. The idea is to diagnose, is the lean condition from a vacuum leak or something, or can we identify that an exhaust leak is causing the lean condition? We know an exhaust leak can cause a lean condition. The question is, can we diagnose it as the cause of the lean condition? So there's a slight difference there. Now obviously the increased oxygen is going to cause, let's look at our fuel trim here, and actually in red, let's look at a, actually we're going to do a wideband, so let's look at a wideband sensor response in red here. And this is what we would expect to see. So if our car is a perfect baseline, then we should be just about around 0 at our long-term fuel trim, of course. And on the air fuel sensor, because I don't remember exactly what the expected voltage output should be. And if you're not familiar with air fuel sensors, I have a video that explains these in excruciating detail and compares them with your oxygen sensor output data that you're normally familiar with. But what I've elected to use is an equivalence ratio for my air fuel detection. So if you're not familiar with that, you may want to look at that other video. But don't worry, I'll explain whether the procedure worked or not if you're too lazy to go look at that. We're going to expect, of course, a air fuel equivalence ratio around 1. But then I am going to, at this point, when we induce an exhaust leak, we, of course, will expect the system to go lean due to the extra oxygen that is coming into the system. So that, of course, is going to increase our fuel trim noticeably, while, of course, also increasing slightly our equivalence ratio. Were this an oxygen sensor, we can put O2 sensor down here, I suppose, then of course, if it were an O2 sensor, we would start seeing the trace going lean, which of course would cue the fuel trim to add fuel. And I talk about all of this in my fuel trims video. It's called Secret of Engine Diagnosis, Understanding Fuel Trims. So I'll put links to all of these other videos, but this is what I'm going with as my hypothesis. Now, in order to do a diagnosis, to actually successfully identify an exhaust leak, we're going to have to create some kind of change in the environment, induce a variable. And what I plan on doing for that is increasing the RPM. So at this point, we're going to add an RPM increase. Now, what I believe would probably happen with an RPM increase is if we increase RPM in the engine, then that is going to generate more exhaust, which in my thinking would actually reduce the amount of oxygen that could possibly enter the system because it is overshadowed by the excessive exhaust with the engine at a high RPM or under load. So what that would do actually is, of course, decrease the fuel trim, because at that point the oxygen sensor, which would already be normalized by the short-term fuel trim, by the way, but the long-term fuel trim would be established high. But with reducing that situation, we would start seeing, of course, the oxygen sensor starting to go rich, which of course is going to bring down the short-term fuel trim and thus pull down the long-term fuel trim. So in an air fuel sensor, of course, that is going to be reported by a decrease in the voltage in the air fuel sensor, which will bring our equivalence ratio back down, and we would return closer to a baseline. So I know this is a little confusing here, but let's look at this graph up close, just using fuel trim versus RPM, and it's going to look very familiar to you. So on this more simplified graph, looking at just the fuel trim versus RPM, we can see that at idle, low RPM, of course, there's going to be much less exhaust stream. So I believe that there is going to be more O2 that can get in through the leak. But then as we increase the engine RPM, with increasing our exhaust flow and sort of pushing out that oxygen, we would see the fuel trim start to reduce. And then, of course, when we return back to idle and lower this exhaust stream, more oxygen getting in, and of course, increasing the fuel trim. This would be exactly the same pattern that you would expect to find if the engine had a vacuum leak. So I actually don't think we're going to be able to determine a difference exclusively for an exhaust leak versus a vacuum leak, but that doesn't mean that this isn't totally useless. If we completely eliminate a vacuum leak as a possibility through like a smoke test or something, then really there isn't any other explanation that we would get for this pattern. So that would indicate then that an exhaust leak could be a very reasonable diagnosis, and the direction would go to be to check for an exhaust leak ahead of the O2 sensor. So that, I think, is going to be a little bit unfortunate, because ideally you would like to create some type of unique pattern where it would identify exclusively an exhaust leak over any other possibilities for a lean condition. I doubt we're going to be able to do that, but let's go ahead and test it. So now we'll need to describe the method that we are going to use and ensure that it is properly controlled if this is to become a new diagnostic procedure. So we're going to be using a 2011 Subaru, I think it is, for this, and it doesn't really matter, of course, because it would be universal for any car anyway. But this car, I believe, is going to have no other issues on it. The first thing I'm going to do is warm the car up fully, make sure the exhaust is at operating conditions, both obviously for the reason that we'll want to be at full warm-up, because that's what you would be at to detect your air-fuel ratios and your fuel trims and things, but also we want to make sure that I test for any existing exhaust leaks when the engine is fully warm, to ensure that there is not already a possible exhaust leak on this vehicle that would skew our data. And I'm going to insert the smoke test into the exhaust pipe. And I actually purchased this smoke machine on Craigslist from a mechanic who quit the trade. And then very thoroughly expecting the exhaust system, especially I'll have to go up top where the O2 sensor is. There is no smoke whatsoever coming out, and actually the pressure builds up enough that it almost pops out my smoke inlet. So there are no exhaust leaks on this system, so we are good to go. And the other thing I'm going to have to do, of course, is test for any other possible variables that could cause incorrect data. So I'm going to check for, of course, diagnostic codes. There are none. And of course, validate that my equivalence ratio, my expected voltage, which I did look up, by the way, and I'll show you, and also my fuel trims are all baselined as they would be expected to be on a normal car. All right, and I know this graph is a little confusing, and by the way, I know a lot of you are like, get on with it, man, and just show, can we diagnose this thing or not? I am doing that. I cannot show you that we can detect an exhaust leak with the Scantool unless I can make sure that we do not have an exhaust leak condition or a fuel delivery issue to begin with, because otherwise, how do I know that the variance we see is due to an exhaust leak? But what we have in this mess here, in red, I've got my short-term fuel trim hovering right around 0, as we would hope. In green, I have my long-term fuel trim. There's only one bank on this engine, by the way. And you see that we are at 0 there. So this means that we do not have a pre-existing condition that could possibly cause any type of skew in our data when we induce the variable. We also have our O2 sensor, I'm sorry, it's a wideband O2 sensor voltage, air fuel sensor voltage, which I looked up and should be at 2.3. And then also we have our equivalence ratio in orange, which the equivalence ratio should be at 1. The equivalence ratio scale is over here. The O2 sensor, the wideband sensor. See, this is hard, I'm telling you, with these air fuel sensors. My air fuel sensor voltage scale is here, so we see we're at 2.3, and then over here the lambda is representing the equivalence ratio. If you're not familiar with the equivalence ratio, I suggest seeing my video on wideband sensors, but basically what it is at 1, it means we are in stoichiometry. And if we see the voltage, which we're going to see the biggest change, I believe, if we see the voltage drop, that will indicate a rich condition. It's backwards of an O2 sensor. If we see the voltage increase, then that is going to represent a lean condition. And we would see that also, by the way, in the equivalence ratio in the same way, but probably not with nearly as much amplitude as we would see with the sensor. But first, we're going to have to do one more thing, because this is a science channel here, and we have to make sure that we are going to get proper responses from our oxygen detection. That should go without saying, regardless of your capability of thinking rationally. So let me go ahead and test. And what I'll do is not come back afterwards and say it worked. I will explain initially what I expect to see. I am going to do a wide open throttle followed by an immediate decel, letting go of the throttle. And what that is going to do is create an immediate rich condition followed by a rather lean condition. So we will see here and on the lambda sensor, when I go wide open throttle, a drop representing the rich condition. I know it's backwards for some of you, but that's the way air fuel sensors work. When I let go of the throttle, we will see an increase and then a drop down and then a normalization back to where it is. So let's try that. Okay, and you can see that we got exactly the expected result from both the equivalence ratio and of course from the voltage, which is actually not even a real value, but I'll explain that in my video if you want to watch it. But this is the correct pattern. We now know that we have a completely normalized system to draw our baselines from. Let's go ahead and induce the variable. And as you can see, good scientific thought and process is much like painting. It is all in your prep and groundwork. So what I am going to do to induce our variable is create an exhaust leak actually at the air fuel sensor. This will guarantee that the leak is detected by the air fuel sensor because it will be right there. It will either have to be at the air fuel sensor or ahead of it, obviously, and either way this is going to work. So let's get this. There we go. I sounded like Scotty Kilmer for a second there, except what I'm saying actually is useful. All right. Ow, that is hot. But the other thing that I like about this method that I'm doing to induce the variable is that I can create what we call a dose response. So in other words, I can actually unscrew or screw in the lambda sensor to create more or less of a leak, which might be useful in helping to see if we can identify any difference here. So let me go ahead and unscrew this a few turns, verify we have a leak just by the sound, and then we'll see what it looks like on the scan tool. All right, so let's look at what we've got going on here. If we notice, our short-term fuel trim up here, also shown in red, has now increased. So the short-term fuel trim is going positive, and I can probably control that a little bit more. We still have a negative long-term fuel trim, but I'm betting that is going to change at some point. We also can see that our voltage has decreased. Earlier it decreased a little bit on our wideband sensor. Now notice our equivalence ratio is stabilizing here, but remember we do have fuel trim here, so we are going to see rather rapid adjustment to try to maintain that equivalence ratio, maintain that stoichiometry. Look at our fuel trim again, it jumped up to almost 6.5 there. So let's go ahead and take advantage of the adjustability. Let's see if I can induce a little bit more of a leak without pulling this out of the hole. Okay, what I'm waiting for is to see if we can get some stabilization with the, sorry about that, with the long-term fuel trim here. So what we're looking at, we can see our short-term fuel trim definitely increased. We're up at a 9 short-term fuel trim. We can see that our wideband sensor voltage is going high, which again indicates the lean condition. We're still struggling stabilizing our equivalence ratio because I believe we're still making adjustments here. I may have to run this for a while, but our long-term fuel trim still is not quite responding yet. All right, I'm getting a little bit impatient here, so I'm going to set up some scales to adjust for our anticipated changes here. And we're just going to go ahead and see if we can get a reaction and see what it looks like. And I just cannot get the long-term fuel trim to respond for whatever reason right now. And to be honest with you, I'm really not going to worry about it because it's not all that important. And it's because we have our short-term fuel trim noticeably higher here. So what I'm going to do is graph that short-term fuel trim, which we can predict over time would affect the long-term anyway, and the RPMs down here, and then I've got my voltage down here in this graph just so that I can verify the response. But ideally what I want is to see that really high long-term fuel trim baseline the short-term fuel trim back to 0. But I just don't think that I'm going to be able to get that on my Scantool. So what we're going to do is go ahead and increase the RPM and look at the relationship of RPM to fuel trim. Again, what I am expecting to see is that the fuel trim is going to improve with RPM because we would be pushing this extra exhaust through the system, pushing the oxygen out of the exhaust and therefore improving the lean condition. Let me go ahead and change the scale on the graph here to make this a little bit better. Okay, so what I've done is adjust the scales a little bit so we can see a little bit more of an amplitude change. Okay, so we can see again on the top graph there, the short-term fuel trim improved definitively with the increase in RPM. So let's go back to the board and draw our conclusion from the experiment. Well, by my findings at least, we did support the hypothesis. It certainly makes sense to me. And unfortunately, I did, after doing this, try different things like unscrewing the wideband sensor a little bit more. To be honest with you, you really dramatically have to get some gap in there to detect that exhaust leak. You would have to have, I'm going to suffice it to say it like this. If your lean condition is caused by an exhaust leak, it ain't going to be from a pinhole leak. You are going to absolutely hear it. The car is going to sound like a rice burner for sure, because it was very surprising to me. Just even one thread screwed in really had almost no change at all. I literally had to have the sensor almost hanging out a little bit to get enough air contamination in there to create that lean condition. So I think that the lean condition through an exhaust leak is a little bit of an overrated diagnosis to begin with, because you would almost certainly hear it right off the bat. So anyway, given the data we have, if diagnosing a lean condition and you find your typical intake manifold leak or vacuum leak pattern, well, that also could be an exhaust leak, but it is much less likely, I believe, to be an exhaust leak unless you absolutely can hear it happening. So that's the conclusion that I drew. So, you know, maybe not a total waste of time, but I do still think there is some validation that if you do see this pattern, an exhaust leak does seem that it would be a possibility, but it cannot be differentially diagnosed just based on that data. So my lifelong dream of having an automotive diagnostic procedure named after me does not look like it is going to happen today, but I'm still going to keep thinking and trying, and your ideas are always welcome too. So thanks very much for watching. I hope you had fun, and I hope you found this helpful.